Hi everyone, welcome back to Passmore Books. I am so excited that you're here. I'm Brittany Passmore and I'm excited to talk about some books that I'm really grateful for. Since Thanksgiving is just around the corner, I thought, why not talk about some books that have influenced me and I think changed my life for the better. So let's get started and pass more books. So all the books that I want to talk about today are books that have either, I think, really influenced my life as far as being like a reader, writer, editor, or really influenced my character, I think, and helped me kind of become like who I am. I don't have like a ton of books on this list, mostly because I I feel like I'm grateful for a lot of books. For most of the books that I've read, I've learned a lot from so much that I've read, even if I didn't fully enjoy the book. Like, there's so much you can learn from reading. And I tried to pull out like the top 5 or so that I feel like really were maybe like kind of hallmark points in my life, I guess. I don't know. I wanted to start with the very first chapter book I ever read. I'm back in first grade, and I don't bring this up just to be like a cheesy, like, oh, the very first book I ever read, but really because this first chapter book that I remember finishing, like, I still remember it. It stayed with me, and it's one that I think really set me on a path to loving fantasy, my favorite genre. So this little tiny chapter book is called The King's Equal, and I just remember loving this book, and I read it like over and over again because I loved it so much. It's a very simple story. It has a little bit of a Beauty and the Beast vibe, or like, you know, those retellings with like the Polar Bear King or things like that. Like, it has that kind of vibe to it. So essentially, there's like a peasant daughter who's like so beautiful, and so the king, who's very selfish and prideful and full of himself, he decides that since she is the most beautiful woman in the land, he's going to make her his queen. And so she comes to his castle, and she doesn't just like slide into society and like go with whatever the king is saying. She knows that he's kind of selfish and prideful. She ends up challenging him to like basically live as a peasant would, and he ends up kind of going off with this wolf that can talk. I know it sounds random, but it's really cool, and learning how to become a good person, really. And meanwhile, the princess, I want to say her name is Rosamund, the princess queen, I guess at this point, ends up kind of taking over the affairs of the kingdom and being a much fairer ruler than the king was, and everybody just loves her. So at the end, they come together, and everybody has learned good lessons, and there's a talking wolf. So I really loved this story as a first grader, and it just captured my imagination, and I just loved it. And I really feel like it is the book that set me on the path to like loving fantasy and loving adventures and loving romance. All these things wound up together, and loving magic. I loved that the heroine was a very strong female character. To me, she showed how you can be compassionate and kind without being weak or walked all over, and I love her strength. I've also got to say, wolves are my favorite animal, and part of the reason that I love wolves so much is because I just thought this talking wolf in the story was like the coolest thing. So that's also just kind of like a fun nostalgic thing for me, that like my love of wolves just kind of came from this story. Anyway, it's a very simple, like, first reader kind of book, but I'm really grateful for this book because, like I said, it set me on a path to loving fantasy, to loving reading itself. And I'm so grateful that I found a book that I could kind of disappear into and have an adventure with. It just feels like the book that kind of did the trick and sold me on my love of reading. The next book I want to talk about is actually a series. There's a series that I kind of became obsessed with when I was like 13 that really got me into writing and editing. And that series is The 39 Clues. So The 39 Clues is, well, there's kind of like multiple series within it now. It's kind of grown into like a whole thing. But the original series is 10 books, and each book is written by a different author. The first book is written by Rick Riordan. I can't remember who wrote the second one, but I think the third one is Patrick Carman. Anyway, there's a bunch of different writers who wrote each different book. It's a kind of a mystery adventure series for middle grade / like intro to YA. The premise of this series is that there is this brother and sister, Dan and Amy. Dan is 11, Amy is 14, and they are orphans. They've been raised by their great aunt, but then their grandmother dies. And when their grandmother passes away, who they loved so much, they were super close to her, they go to her funeral, and her lawyer pulls out her will and pulls the Dan and Amy and then a bunch of their other relatives into a room. And he basically says, Grace, the grandmother who passed away, is offering each of you either like, it was like $100,000 or something, like $10,000. I don't know, like a pretty nice amount of money. Every single one of you can have all this money, or you can get into like a team and get a clue that will lead you to 39 different clues around the world that could lead you to an incredible power, an incredible kind of treasure at the end. Kind of like a treasure hunt, but like a real treasure hunt. And Dan and Amy are like, what? Like, is there this like secret that Grace has been keeping from us? They find out that they've been related to all these people, like really famous historical figures like Mozart or Benjamin Franklin or Anastasia, or like things like that. And so their great aunt, Beatrice, she's like, just take the money. And they're like, no, we're gonna leave you. We're gonna go rogue, and we're gonna take this clue, and we're gonna go on this clue hunt. And they end up grabbing their au pair, Nellie, kind of their nanny, and going on this adventure to find these clues that end up being ingredients to kind of like a serum that is very powerful and like kind of world-changing sort of thing. Really fun adventure, lots of mysteries, lots of puzzles, learning about real history, and there's a really, really fun cast of characters that they're unique characters that are just so engaging and so fun to follow. I will say this series isn't perfect. There are things that I wish had kind of turned out differently, or certain things that I would probably change if I had been in charge of writing it. But when I first picked up this series, my cousin suggested it to me and my brothers. And so when I picked it up, the first 3 books were out. And I read those first 3 books so fast. And then I was like waiting for the 4th one to come out. And I was like, what happens next? And I was just so invested. And I kind of became obsessed with the series. Like, I was so involved with these different characters and their relationships, and really, really, really wanted Ian and Amy to get together. And it's fine. It's fine. I'm a hopeless romantic. It's okay. And so as I was waiting for the 4th book to come out, I was just online looking up some stuff about the 39 clues, just trying to reach out and like find something to like engage with, to just like express this passion that I have for this series and how excited I was about it. And I ended up finding some fan fiction about the 39 clues and reading one story and going like, oh, that was really fun. What is this? And at first I thought it was like a real story, and I was like, what? When did this happen? And then it was like, oh, this is like just something that somebody made up for fun, that somebody else wrote and just put up for other people to enjoy. And then I realized that like lots of people were writing lots of fun stories about books, and not just the 39 clues, but like tons of books and TV shows and movies and things. And they were just like writing for fun and to keep enjoying the own stories that they loved so much and fuel their passion for it. I was blown away by just how fun that was for me, and I just dove right in. I started writing my own ideas for stories about the 39 clues, and I wrote like a ton about 39 clues. And I kind of thought about ideas and sort of started stories for like other books too and other things. But what just kept bringing me back to fan fiction was my love for that series. I think especially because it was a world and cast of characters that I just had so much fun being in, and the story wasn't finished yet, so I felt like I could kind of like explore my own story if I wanted to, right? And so that's when I really started writing a lot. I'd kind of written my own little stories, or started kind of little stories before this, but I had never been very serious about it. And so this was the first time that I really started writing and writing and writing and writing and writing, and I felt like I couldn't stop, and all I wanted to do was write and chat with my friends on fan fiction about the books that we loved and the characters we loved, and then I started making friends, and we started kind of swapping our stories so we could kind of edit them for each other, and I loved that and thought it was so fun. And so that really just launched this incredible passion for writing and editing that I didn't really realize that I could have. Like, I just, thought reading was like kind of my hobby that I did, and then suddenly writing and editing became something that like I could do. So I feel like 39 Clues really launched me on a path that made me realize that working with books and words was something that I loved so much and that I wanted to do with my life. I don't know if I can really like base my whole career off of like my experience with fan fiction, but I did learn a lot from it, and I'm really, really grateful that I picked up the 39 Clues and loved it so much that I dove into something that I still love so much today. The next book that I am so grateful for is, again, a series, and it's The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan and finished by Brandon Sanderson. Let me start with the fact that it is 15 books long if you're including the prequel. It's epic fantasy. Like the books, like, do you see my Brandon Sanderson books here? This like Way of Kings, like his Stormlight Archive, right? A lot of the Wheel of Time books are like this thick, like they're big. It's basically like there's a chosen one. He's called the Dragon Reborn, and it's him kind of on the quest to defeat the Dark One. One of the author's intentions was to try to introduce a Lord of the Rings story, but make it a little more realistic and kind of see it in a realistic world. And so the first book is full of a lot of fantasy tropes that really harken back to Lord of the Rings. But from there, it really, really evolves a lot. And you realize that this world is actually like, has a sci-fi past. And there was just like a breaking of the world that kind of threw them back into like medieval times and makes it that kind of like Lord of the Rings fantasy vibe. But there's a huge cast of characters, there's tons of action, there's lots and lots of character growth, there's so much, but I loved it. There's a lot of people who get kind of like disheartened, I guess, or kind of start to get bored a little bit with some of the like later middle books, because they feel like it's a bit of a slog. They feel like all the action's slowing down, and there's a lot of focus on politics, and there's just so many characters, and they're all in different places doing different things, and it feels like it just is taking forever. But when I read this series, I read it in high school. Like I think I read the whole thing basically throughout my senior year. I remember reading it for the first time and not being bored ever. Like, sure, there were some books that I liked better than others in the series, but I was never I was just never bored by it. I never felt like I was going through the slog, as many fans lovingly call it. A lot of people also feel like Robert Jordan's writing is very description heavy, and that can kind of wear down on you, and sometimes it feels like a lot of description to get through. And I didn't feel like that was a negative while I was reading it. Occasionally, yeah, like there was a lot of repetition in their description. Fine, I'll give you that. But overall, I was just blown away by how real and transporting the story felt to me. I just remember occasionally like looking up from the book and kind of being like astonished that I was just sitting in my room and that I was like not in the Wheel of Time. It was so transporting for me, and I just loved the adventure I went on. I loved seeing those characters grow throughout the whole story, and wow, it was an incredible journey for me to read. I'm really grateful that all the books were out when I read them, because I remember my parents telling me about how they would be reading the books and they would have to like reread the whole series when a new book would come out, like over and over again. The Wheel of Time series is my favorite series of all time. I guess so far. I should say Stormlight Archive might take that place eventually, although maybe the nostalgia for Wheel of Time will make that stay my favorite. I don't know. But I love it so much because the way it transported me, like I said. But also, I think when I finished The Wheel of Time, that's when I realized that like I actually needed to find a career where I was working with books. And at the time, I felt like I wanted to write books, which I didn't quite go that direction in the end. But knowing that I wanted to work with novels, especially stories like that could just transport you and give you an incredible journey and teach you so much at the same time, I just knew that I wanted to work with books. And that's why I approached college by saying, you know what, we'll go for an English major for now. And then eventually that turned into discovering an editing minor, which turned into an editing major. And here I am now working with books and writers. And even now I've started this channel just because I love books so much and love talking about them. And I'm just so grateful for The Wheel of Time for being such an incredible saga that changed my life, brought me so much joy, and has made me aware of so many other people in this kind of Wheel of Time community who are also so passionate about books. And I'm really grateful. Believe it or not, I'm gonna actually veer away from fantasy for a second. Next, I wanted to talk about Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. And I just can't help but smile, even though this book is so sad in so many ways. If you don't know this book, it's a classic. And you might notice a bit of a trend that I like really big books. Like Les Mis is like as big as one of these Stormlight Archive books. Like so big, so long. And again, like a lot of people have such a hard time getting through Les Mis, and there were only 2 parts in Les Mis that I had a hard time getting through. I think there was one part where Victor Hugo was describing some cathedral, and that was like a little bit like, okay, I'm done listening about this cathedral. The second part was when he was talking about Napoleon and the wars and kind of the history of all that, and it was a little bit like, do I really need this history lesson right now? I don't think I do. Aside from those 2 parts, I actually like really enjoyed pretty much the whole story, and like it wasn't hard ever to come back to, because you know those books when you're like, ugh, I would love to read this book more, but I'm kind of stuck in this part, and so maybe I'll go do something else because I'm not interested, and you just kind of never get past the boring part, right? Like Les Mis didn't really have that for me, except for, you know, those parts that I mentioned, but I just kind of powered through them. So, if you don't know this premise of Les Mis, basically a man named Jean Valjean, he is arrested for a crime. He steals a loaf of bread, but he's not like doing it to like be a bad guy. He's literally trying to feed his sister and nephew who are starving. And he gets thrown in jail, of course, and he just feels like the system is just merciless to him, and nobody will like trust him now or think him honorable just because of this one thing he did. And he's so frustrated, and so when he finally gets out of prison, he decides, okay, I'm just gonna like go forward, pretend to be a different guy. I'm gonna like change my identity, and I'm just gonna start over because no one will give me the time of day knowing that I'm an ex-convict. And so he kind of starts over, and he ends up having this really powerful encounter with a bishop who is forgiving and who doesn't care that he was in jail once, and who like gives him silver to like help pay his way through life. And so Jean Valjean realizes that like there are actually good people in this world. Not everyone is good, not everyone is kind, but some people are good and they forgive. And that really changes him, and he goes forward promising to be a better man because of that. And that kind of leads him to adopt a child later and take care of her. Anyway, there's all sorts of things that go on, and the story goes on for years and years. Again, there's a lot of characters, a very memorable cast of characters. There's drama and passion and action, and It's great. You're probably at least somewhat familiar with the musical if you haven't read the book. And the musical is like good. I love the musical. I have so much nostalgia for that musical because I grew up with it. I knew every single song by the time I was probably like 10. I don't know, like I loved that musical growing up so much. But when I finally read the book, again, I think I was in high school. I think I was a junior. That sounds about right. So when I read it for the first time, like I knew the whole story. I knew that obviously the book had been condensed a lot to fit into a musical, right? But I knew the whole story coming in, right? And I was really impressed with just how engaging the writing was for me. I think because at that time I was a little bit wary about classics sometimes because sometimes it feels like maybe the writing just feels too old or not relatable enough, I guess, because it's written so much in the past. But I was pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed Victor Hugo's writing overall. But what I really treasure about this book is just the love and the pain and the lessons all involved in it. I need like probably a whole video to talk about all that you learn from Les Miserables, just like I would need a whole video to talk about like all that you would learn about the Wheel of Time, probably multiple videos. But these characters just go through so much and you learn so much from what they go through. I feel like, well, two things especially stick out to me that I feel like helped me just want to be a better person. One line that I always come back to is, I believe it's Jean Valjean who at one point says, "To love another person is to see the face of God." And that line has just always really resonated with me. And it reminds me of just things that I believe in my own faith and really just resonates with me. And just once in a while, it'll just like pop into my brain as I'm like studying my own scriptures or like interacting with somebody, and I'll just remember that phrase. I think it's really influenced me for good. The other thing that really struck me so much about Les Mis is reading about the bishop in the beginning, who I mentioned, and realizing like, and he's in the musical like for basically 2 minutes, kind of having that important interaction with Jean Valjean. But in the book, you actually get like at least a whole chapter, I think maybe you get multiple chapters about the bishop and his whole life and how completely selfless he was his whole life. Everyone expected him to have a nice house, have a nice carriage, have super nice things, and all the time he'd be like, I don't need this. I don't need this extra like carriage. Let's sell that or give it to somebody who really needs it. Give the money to people who need it. And then I can just make do with like this, whatever. He made do with something. And sometimes he would give up stuff and make do with nothing. Like he was just so selfless. And eventually the bishop just came to mean so much to me. And he became an example of giving and forgiving and mercy and compassion. And just, wow, he's a fantastic character, I think, who inspires me to be better. So there's lots more that I could go on to say about Les Mis, but I'm really, really grateful for this book and just for all the goodness that it inspires. The last book, which is another series that I want to express my gratitude for, is a historical fiction series. It's called The Kingdom and the Crown by Gerald N. Lund. To me, it has a similar place in my heart as Les Mis does. I feel like it's a series that kind of helped shape who I am and my character a little bit. So this series takes place in the time when Jesus lived in Israel, and it follows fictional characters who were living in Jerusalem or Nazareth or just, I don't know, all of many cities around there. They're living there in that time, and they meet Jesus and interact with him and the disciples, and they kind of go on their own journey of faith to decide if they're going to follow Christ or not. And it's so well done. If you've seen the show that's recently come out, The Chosen, it has kind of that same vibe where you're following these very ordinary people and they're seeing these miracles from the Savior and they're hearing his teachings and they're not perfect people, and they're learning to become disciples and to follow Christ. Again, there's a fantastic cast of characters. There's action and romance too. Like, it's not just people sitting around listening to Jesus preach. But what I also love about this series is that there's so much research about like the actual history and the culture and the time, and so you also see the influence of the Romans there, and you get actually quite a good sense of a few different aspects of Jewish culture that actually really give an interesting insight into why Jesus taught things the way he taught, or how he was teaching them, or what things he taught might have meant to the people in that day, in that time. And it's just so fascinating, and you can learn so much about the Gospels and that time period and what Jesus taught. For me, I read this series when I was about 14-ish, I think. And that was actually a time in my life when I started to get really serious about my faith and what I wanted to believe. I mean, my whole life, my parents had raised me in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they taught me that I needed to find out for myself if it was true. I needed to be the one who read my scriptures for myself. I needed to be the one who wanted to pray on my own and, ask if God was there and whatnot, right? Like, they never wanted me to just go to church with them because that's what I was supposed to do. They wanted me to like find my own faith, my own testimony. And for a long time, I was kind of like, okay, cool, yeah, I feel like I'm probably getting my own testimony. But around the time that I turned 14 was when I feel like I got more serious about it and realized how real my faith needed to be. So there was a lot of things that I was doing at that time, like studying the scriptures and really searching in them. I was going to seminary classes, I was going to youth camps, and I was going to church. I was praying, I was going to our temple, like I was doing lots of things to explore and learn and see how I felt, and if I felt like this was all true and right for me. And this series came along and became so influential in how I saw Christ. I think before reading that series, I had a bit of a hard time really seeing Christ as a real person. He just was kind of almost like a mythological figure to me. Not that I didn't believe that he truly existed, but it was just hard to relate to him. It was hard to see him as a real person who knew me. And that series was about a lot of stuff. There were a lot of fun characters and fun, exciting things happening. But it also really taught me more about who Jesus Christ is. And it's not the only thing. It wasn't like the one thing that sold me and made me commit to my religion, but it really influenced me. And it was one more thing that really helped me understand more about who Christ is and what he can be in my life and how he can help me and how much he loves me. So I'm really grateful for that series, for how it changed my view of my faith and how it helped me learn more and grow more in that faith. Okay, well, those are all the books that I wanted to talk about today. Like I said, I'm grateful for many more books than just these ones, but these are some that just kind of stick out as ones that were really, really influential in who I became as a reader, writer, editor, and also just as a person. Hopefully a good person. Thank you so much for watching. I would love to hear about what books you are grateful for. Maybe you have some similar experiences to me. Maybe you have a completely different list that you're grateful for completely different reasons. Whatever it is, I would love to hear the books that you are most grateful for. If you like this video, feel free to give it a thumbs up or subscribe to my channel. And I hope to see you guys next time to pass some more books. Bye!